All right, so let's talk about what statistics is and look at an overview of it. Statistics is the science of collecting, organizing, and analyzing data. So why would we do this? Well, generally, if we want to think about an overview of how this process works, is you would start with something you have a question about. Something in the real world you have a question about. And then you have to think about, well, who's involved in that thing that you're trying to discover? You know, who or what would you need to find information about to answer that question? And once you decide who or what is involved, you would be looking at what's called your population for your statistical study. That would be everyone involved that you're interested in. But generally, we can't collect data on a huge group. So what we do is we identify a subset, which we call a sample, and we look at this smaller group, and that's who we collect data from. So we collect data from the sample, and then we summarize it, and often we're going to be graphing it, or we may be calculating numbers related to it, for instance, an average, and that would be called a statistic. So when we analyze a sample, we often create statistics or numbers that tell us about that sample. And then we're going to use that information to actually approximate values about the entire group. So when we do that, we're actually estimating what we call parameters related to the population. And then we finally end up with, that basically takes us back to the population. And we're going to draw conclusions about the entire group and maybe answer our question by looking at what we found from the statistics that can approximate the parameters of our situation. So it's kind of a circular process. You basically start with a question, but then once you identify who's involved, you're going to take a little group of who's involved to then measure things about that smaller group to approximate things about the original group. Now, we used a couple of words in the last slide that I want to really key in on. We talked about the population of sample. Now, the population is the entire set of people or things that's being studied. It's the entire group you're studying, whereas the sample is a subset of the population, so a group, a small group from that population from which you actually collect the data. The raw data is collected. So the population is the entire group you're studying, and the sample is the smaller group that you actually collect data from. So let me give you an example. Say you're interested in determining the average age of college students. Well, this involves college students. Okay, so what we're really thinking about here in terms of our population would be all college students. That's who we're interested in. Now, we're going to ask a question about the college students, but that's who's involved in our study is college students. Now, what we can't necessarily query all college students. That would be millions of people. So what generally researchers do is they use a subset of that of college students, and they could get that subset in many different ways. If you're a researcher who's also a college student, maybe you would just ask your class. So your maybe math class, or the students in your math class would be the college students that you actually ask something of. So in this way, if we think about population and sample in this example, the population would be all college students. And we often use the word all when we describe a population. I encourage you to do that. And the sample would be the smaller group that we actually collect data on. So that would be students in your math class. All right, now we also talked about what's called a statistic and a parameter. A statistic is a number describing the characteristics of the sample, and here's a hint. Statistic starts with S, sample starts with S. And a statistic is found by summarizing the raw data collected from the sample. So again, statistic is some number describing the characteristics of the sample. For instance, an average. The parameter is a number that describes the characteristics of the population. Once again, a hint for remembering this, parameter starts with P, population starts with P. Now, if we go back to this example we had up here, the statistic would be the average age. This is what we're calculating about the student. So this would be the average age of the students in my sample. Now, the sample is the students in your math class, so the average age of the students in your math class. And then the parameter would be what we're really interested in, which is everybody, specifically the average age of all college students. So I'm emphasizing the all there again. Let's look at a couple of examples to make sure we get these definitions down. So first example, a poll of 2,060 American adults shows that 42% said they are very worried about climate change. Okay, so what we have is a poll of 2,060 American adults. Now, American adults are who we're investigating in this situation. So that would be the population if we look at all of them. So again, using the word all when we're talking about population, all American adults. The sample is who we actually collect data from. So that would be the 2,060 American adults that were sampled or surveyed. All right, so the statistic would be the actual calculation you got out of that survey. So if we look at the further along in the sentence, it says 42% so they're very worried about climate change. Well, those 42%, that's a number that was calculated based on the poll. So that would be the statistic. So the statistic is 42% of American adults are very worried about climate change. And we use that statistic to go ahead and determine something about the population. We use it to talk about the parameter, or estimate the parameter. And the parameter would be that same type of calculation, but we really don't know it. That's why we did the sample. So we would say it's the percent, which we don't know, of American adults who are very worried about climate change. So again, population is about everybody. Parameter is about the calculation related to everyone. We usually can't survey all American adults. So that's why we create the sample and we then calculate the statistic to be able to approximate what's happening with everyone. So that's the statistical process. Oh, one more example. To determine the average diameter of pines in a particular forest, researchers randomly tag and measure 45 pine trees within the forest. So the population would be all of the pine trees in the forest. The sample would be those 45 pine trees that were surveyed. Or you could say specifically they were measured. What were these people measuring? They were measuring the diameters to find the average diameter. So the statistic, and it didn't tell us what it is, but we could say it's the average diameter of just the trees that were surveyed. So of the 45 trees measured. And then remember, the whole idea behind the sample and statistic is to then tell us what's happening with the entire forest. So the parameter would be the average diameter of all trees in the forest, or specifically pine trees. So again, that word all, when we're talking about population or parameter, the average diameter of all pine trees in the forest.